Great, thank you, Pat, and hi, everybody. Delighted to be connecting with you tonight. As Pat mentioned, I'm going to talk about our advocacy program, which PPMD has really made a strategic priority for the organization in regards to having an advocacy program these past 20 years. And in particular, advocacy at the federal level, which I'm going to talk about. You're all naturally advocates already. As parents, you advocate for your child on a daily basis, whether it is for care or working with your school for your child's education, access to services and support. It's what you've been doing since the day of diagnosis. And this is so critical. And we're always trying to help and give you support while you're doing that, those types of advocacy efforts. But there's another critical form of advocacy that we hope we can make the case for you to be involved in more, and that is advocacy at the federal level. It is to essentially work with Congress to get more focus and funding for the muscular dystrophies, Duchenne in particular, and this is done through advocating with your elected members of Congress. So this is your American right to speak with those people who represent you and talk to them about where they should put priorities in federal dollars and your tax dollars at the end of the day. Yesterday, Pat discussed when we started, we really did begin to look at the key questions we wanted to answer. As a community to move towards potential treatments. But, ultimately what we discovered was there were huge gaps that existed to enable true drug development in Duchenne, and those gaps you see here on the screen. We needed to find those critical missing pieces. And one of the key elements there was a federal investment in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We knew the federal government investment in the disease would be critical, and it was minimal when we first began our efforts. That was one of the things we discovered. So we looked at the function of federal agencies and their potential to impact Duchenne. We realized there was two particular targets we needed to focus on early on, those being the Center for Disease Control. I think many of us are aware of them, especially in light of the pandemic. Most people hear about them when there's some sort of infectious disease outbreak or something global that garners media attention. But the function of CDC is much broader than just emergencies. The CDC supports health promotion, prevention, preparedness, which includes efforts to standardize the way care is delivered in a particular disease, and really understanding, how people are diagnosed and really the numbers around who's diagnosed, the incidence and prevalence. This made them a likely target because, in the end with the CDC, we needed more consistency with care across the country. We saw a lack of that early on as an organization. Doctors were doing different things. We needed more accurate data on that incidence and prevalence number. It wasn't clear how many people were affected by the disease, and there were certainly limited tools for diagnosis, which we saw a need for change. The other federal agency that really began to emerge as a group that we needed to engage more with is National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is really the primary agency that funds medical research in our country and really has impacted the entire world with the investment. NIH is the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. It's why there's a lot of breakthroughs have come out of NIH funding for diseases like AIDS and cancer. They often fund those early good ideas in the preclinical space that we'll talk a bit more about later, and we've touched on really before human stage testing. And we came to understand that their investment in Duchenne was not much. At the time in 1994, we needed engagement and investment if we were going to move the needle. So really, why the NIH? As I said, they're the largest funder of biomedical research. There was little money. We needed to move from these early ideas to humans. And we also needed to develop biomarkers and understand the disease progression better, which is another role NIH investment plays. So in 2000, we actually hired lobbyists in 2000. We met a father who was an insurance lobbyist by the name of Joel Wood. And, you know, it's like when you go to a foreign land, you have to learn the language. You have to understand the speak. And there's a million acronyms. And there's just a way of doing things. And that's why we put an investment in hiring these lobbyists. And we held the very first workshop on Duchenne in 2000, bringing together the National Institutes of Health, CDC, patient advocacy. Pat really led the effort to get this first initial workshop, okay? And what that workshop led to was, as Pat mentioned before, crafting of a bill called the MD Care Act. This was a pivotal moment in our community. We worked with Congress and our lobbyists to craft that legislation, and it became an inflection point. The bill was passed in 2001. And, you know, it laid the foundation for really the progress you see today. And we went over the sort of tenements of that bill, creating research centers of excellence through NIH funding at institutions that you all are well aware of around the country. The purpose to move that research forward to human testing, work with the CDC on care and data and tracking, and then also create a muscular dystrophy coordinating committee to link all those relevant agencies that touch Duchenne to work together and create a plan, essentially. And over time, we've been able to add amendments to the original bill as things changed, as we learned more about the disease, as research started to move forward, and the research community was galvanized to start putting more effort into the disease. We've expanded that bill. In 2008, we added additional muscular dystrophies, as well as expanding to Becker. We added institutes that touch the muscular dystrophies like heart, lung, and blood. We expanded the original tracking, and then the development of those care considerations for the first time to put on paper, what do we know about care and how can we do it better consistently across the country. And then 2014, we have the additional amendments added where we expanded our efforts into endocrine, pulmonary, cardiac, and did other things with MD StarNet, sharing the data that had been collected across different agencies and expanding that care consideration document for the adult population, because we had now people living longer. And it was because of these efforts, because of care getting better. All this has led to really working in a public-private partnership with industry, companies, and clinics around the country and advocacy to move this forward. And we recognize there's still a lot of work to do, but this has really set the stage for what we see today. So those programs out of CDC have really evolved, tracking how many people have Duchenne. This is through a program called MD StarNet. There are certain sites that are tracking these numbers and developing data points and learning more about how care is being delivered. It's been a critical piece to our understanding. We actually now know it's 1 in 5,000 live male births. The former numbers used to be 1 in 3,500. Well, the money and the investment allowed us to get a better understanding of that. It also, as I mentioned, produced these care considerations, which PPMD led with other advocacy organizations and the clinical community, and those were updated in 2018 after they were first published. And we have on our website an easy way to get that information, and Rachel talked about that yesterday, and we'll make sure everyone has those links if you haven't accessed them yet to date. So for the NIH, we've also seen major advancements in research because of these Wellstone centers that we mentioned. They've been set up. They are rotated on a 5-year basis where hospitals or institutions come in and apply to be a Wellstone. These are the current centers that are in operation. And they're looking at all types of research, from gene therapy to gene editing to downstream and inflammation. And there are other grant programs out of the NIH, not just the investment for the Wellstone centers, where there's been Duchenne-specific research happening through NIH funding. They funded target identification, biomarkers, animal model development. So, even when you all look at exon skipping and gene therapy, a lot of that early work happened at the federal level because we lobbied for it, and we were able to work with our partners in the space, in the research space, encourage them to be involved, and it's really transformed things. And every therapy you see to date in that pipeline that we've shown actually does, it has been touched by federal money at some point in the process. So the MD Care Act does not fund these programs. MD Care Act is a framework bill, meaning that there's no specific money attached to it. We actually go and lobby for that through what's called appropriations. It's a fancy way of saying how we pay for these programs through tax dollars. Appropriations is Congress has the purse strings, so they allocate that funding. So that's why we talk to Congress, develop relationships, and go to Washington every year, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, so that we can tell them about the priorities and the programs that we need to fund. And as Duchenne has evolved and advanced, we're able to update them with what are the current gaps that exist and where does federal money fit in. And then they give that to the agencies and they give them direction. President releases his budget, and then Congress starts the process, and there's a back and forth in the appropriations process, and then the appropriation bills come out. And then along with those bills is report language. So you think of it as they get these federal agencies like the NIH and the CDC, they get this pot of money, and then there's a report that goes with that money that gives them direction. So where they'll actually look at the report and it will say, for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, here is our guidance with spending that money. Because we, the people, as Congress, are telling the federal agencies, this is how you can best put those tax dollars to use. And this is what our constituents are telling us are the needs. And that's why we go. That's why we advocate. We get into this process every year in appropriations. And our agency focus has expanded over time. It's been remarkable that it started with CDC and NIH, but now we have many drugs in the pipeline. We started engaging the FDA over 10 years ago. Social Security Administration is also involved in our strategy, Center for Medicaid and Medicare, and then the DoD, the Department of Defense, which we'll get into a little bit later because it's probably confusing of why it's the DoD invested in Duchenne, but we can talk about that. Oh, some animations here for you. So over time, the proof's in the pudding here. You can see 2001 when we started, we've gone to Congress over time. Every year we've advocated for money, and every year it's been about $6 million roughly, give or take, and we've been able to put $107 million through the CDC, through appropriations, through tax dollars, and focused it specifically on muscular dystrophy, and a lion's share of that is actually for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's where the care considerations came about, but this has happened because of those bills and because of the appropriations process. And because of you all, because we have people go to Congress with us every year and say, this is where you need to prioritize for Duchenne. Same story with NIH. You can see a remarkable amount of funding that has gone through, and nearly $500 million alone for NIH funding. That's one heck of a fundraiser. We've always felt that we have to leverage the resources that are out there, because that brought in federal money. We have advocacy groups, not just PPMD, that are funding research as well, but it takes a village. It's not just one organization or the other that are going to tackle this entire thing. It has to be together. It has to be collaborative. Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense has an interesting program called the Congressionally Directed Mandated Research Program, and Duchenne is a condition that is within that program that gets funding. And Pat actually serves on the review board of the grants that come through this program, and we team up with the father I mentioned before, Joel Wood, on this effort with the DoD to ensure that we have money going in every year. And it's a peer review process. And the DoD program has funded things like exon skipping, drugs aimed at inflammation, clinical trial readiness, all these things. So all together, we've been able to really move the field. And luckily, this past year, we were able to lobby for a huge increase in this funding at $10 million. And to date, around $75 million has gone in to the DoD specific for Duchenne. So this is well over a $700 million investment in total for Duchenne muscular dystrophy through federal money. And the accomplishments are pretty remarkable here. Hundreds of Duchenne-related grants, care considerations, better understanding of the data, better outcome measures, biomarkers, natural history studies. We've been able to get those funded as well as funding them ourselves. So it's always this partnership with the federal government. 3 approved therapies, hopefully more to come, and a huge pipeline full of promise here that you've seen many times. So I'm going to move on next very quickly just to the FDA, because they have their own specific role in terms of how we advocate with them. There's additional strategies that go beyond funding for the FDA. Our goal with the agency is to advocate for tools that can accelerate access to therapies, and importantly, ensure that they are continuing to take your input into the process so that when they're evaluating those therapies, they know how you consider benefit and risk and what you're willing to trade off on. That data is so important to their understanding and a way for them to make better decisions about potential therapies. I'm going to go really briefly into the FDA, just some background. You all know this they sit under the executive branch. Their mission is really to protect the public, promote public health, and follow the laws and rules set forth by Congress. And this is where we come in. This is where advocacy comes in. This is how we're able to influence the process. And the process has really changed over time because of major tipping points that have occurred in FDA history after it was first established in 1906. It was actually established because there was an issue with food regulation, where there was learning of unhygienic conditions in Chicago stockyards. This is from a book called Up and Sinclair, where they learned there was no regulation over food, and the agency's authority was established there. And it was further established for drugs in 1938. After there was an elixir, it was improperly prepared and caused mass poisoning in the United States because there wasn't enough oversight over the drugs that were being developed. It actually caused the death of 100 people. It brought about more power to the FDA over drug safety. 1962, a drug called thalidomide, a sedative used for morning sickness, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Pat, for pregnancy. It caused birth defects, and this occurred in Canada and Europe and other countries. And here, that tipping point brought about the need to prove scientifically that a medication was not only safe, but it was also effective. So this law gave the FDA more powers over regulation of drugs. And then finally, I think everyone's very familiar with the major tipping point with the HIV/AIDS crisis. So these were issues around FDA's capacity to review medications. They lacked the resources and the time to actually review all the potential drugs that were coming in and being developed for HIV/AIDS to slow the pace. Or rather, there was a slow pace of getting the medications. And with that, a law called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, was born. And this is reviewed every 5 years, renewed rather, by FDA. These are essentially fees paid by companies, drug companies, who are applying for new drugs to speed the time to review by adding resources to the FDA. And with PDUFA renewed every 5 years, we've had additional authority added to the FDA on early phase research, on bioterrorism, and then rules around long-term post-market safety. And then a major tipping point for us, for the patient voice, came in 2012 with the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act. So that was another name for the bill that fell under PDUFAV. And this is all about really mandating that the FDA take the voice of the patient into consideration when reviewing new drugs. It's hard to believe that we had to legislate that the FDA listen to patients when reviewing drugs that patients are going to take, but it's true. We had to legislate it so we could change the rules in which the FDA operates. And this is a bill that was passed in 2012. It launched this new initiative called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, or PFDD. We advocated strongly for the provisions within this bill. That new initiative was launched out of FDA because of it. And rare disease now is being considered more so for accelerated approvals. they now listen and talk to rare disease experts, something that was being blocked before, and then this launch of this new initiative to incorporate patient views into medical decision-making. And since then, we've developed a slew of tools for the agency, for drug companies and the like, to better inform them about what patients think and feel about emerging therapies. We've done the Duchenne registry. You're going to hear a little bit about this more. We've done a series of what's called patient preference studies. That's quantifying the patient voice. We give you a survey. We ask you, if you had drug A versus drug B, which had these benefits and these risks, which drug would you choose? And we're able to quantify your preferences for benefits and risks. And we've done a series of these, all in an effort to quantify the patient voice and give it to the agency and say, you need to consider this when you're reviewing drugs for Duchenne. And finally, we produced the first ever guidance for FDA on our community about 6 years ago. And all of this has now come out where FDA now considers what's called patient experience data in their review and in their consideration. And this takes many forms. It's used to inform clinical trial design. It takes the form of Duchenne registry data, which you'll hear about, patient testimonials, the preference data, et cetera. So these are things the FDA is interested in. It's so important with a rare disease, and it's why we've put investment into the patient experience data. And finally, I do want to encourage you, I really hope that you'll consider doing the advocacy conference. Next year's our 20th anniversary of the MD Care Act. We're going to mark that with a very big event. We have over 150 advocates that come every year. And the reason you've seen all the results to date is because of you all. It's not, it's not just us going to the Hill. It's over 150 families every year talking to their members of Congress. We give you all the tools you need to do this. And we equipped you for your meetings. I think Stephanie's on the line today, and she actually attended this year, and she can talk to you about it as well. And I hope you'll join us in March when we hopefully will be able to do this in person. But to date, we've been very pleased to have a lot of impact at the federal level through our advocacy efforts. And I know I've gone over time, and I apologize for that. But I'm happy to take questions before I pass it over to Nicole, who's going to talk about community engagement.